Montana Territory, spring of 1883. The wind moved low through the cottonwoods along the Musselshell River, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant smoke. Leora Prescott gripped the rifle tighter in her hands, heart hammering as the creak of saddle leather broke the quiet outside her homestead cabin. She had not expected anyone. Not since the last snow melted. She stepped out onto the porch, rifle aimed without shaking. A tall figure on horseback stopped 20 feet away, one gloved hand lifted in peace. His hat shadowed his face, but the edge of his jaw was rough with beard, and his shirt was dusted from miles of riding. "I ain't here to cause you trouble," he said, voice low and even. "I saw the smoke. Just makin' sure nobody's in need." Leora's grip eased just a little. "You alone?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied him. He did not look like a thief or a drifter. His boots were worn but clean, his horse well fed. The man sat like someone who had worked land before, not just passed through it. "I am fine," she said, lowering the rifle. "Thank you." He nodded and dismounted slow, keeping his hands where she could see them. "Name's Waylon Boone," he said. "Was headed toward Fort Benton to trade pelts, got caught in last week's storm, horse through a shoe. I fixed it, but I have not eaten anything warm in 2 days." Leora hesitated. She had not spoken to anyone face to face in nearly a year. Not since her father died and left her with this patch of land. She had held it together with stubbornness and the little garden seeds she had saved. She looked at the man again. Something in his eyes steadied her. He did not look desperate, just tired and honest. "You can water your horse and I have stew." Waylon tipped his hat. "Thank you kindly." They sat later on the front steps, her pot of rabbit stew between them. He ate with slow care, not like someone starving but someone grateful. The fire crackled. Somewhere out past the hills, a coyote called. "How long have you been out here alone?" he asked. She looked down. "Since last May. My pa got sick, did not make it." Waylon nodded, respectful. "You did all this yourself," she gave a small nod. "I had to, I do not have anyone else." "You have guts," he said simply. "Most would have sold off and headed east." "I never wanted the east," she said. "I like it quiet." They did not speak again for a while. She watched the firelight move across his face. He had kind eyes. Tired, yes, but kind. He stayed that night in her barn. She gave him a blanket and her father's old saddlebag to rest his head on. The next morning he helped chop wood without asking, fixed the north fence too. Then he planned to ride on, but she surprised herself. "You could stay another day if you wanted." He studied her, then nodded once. "All right." 1 day turned to 3. In that time, he fixed the chicken coop roof, taught her a better way to set her snares, and even managed to get her mule to stop biting. He never got close, never crossed any boundary. At night, he slept in the barn, but she could feel the air between them shift. On the 4th evening, they shared coffee on the porch. He sat on the step below her, elbows on his knees. The light was gold across the fields. "I have not talked this much in a long time," she said quietly. He looked back at her. "Me neither." She hesitated. Her fingers brushed the cup in her lap, nervous. "I have never been kissed," she said suddenly. The words hung in the air. Waylon turned slowly to face her. Then, gentle as a man stepping into a church, he took off his hat and said, "Let's start slow." She looked at him, heart thudding. He did not reach for her, did not move closer, just sat there, bareheaded and patient. "I do not know how to," she began. "You do not have to know anything," he said. "I am not here to rush you." They sat in silence again. This time it felt different. Something warm unfolded between them. That night he knocked on the door before heading to the barn. She opened it. "I will be up early," he said. "Thought I'd check the west fence. Looked like something pushed through." She nodded. "All right." He turned to go, then paused. "You are not the only one who never had much of a chance for certain things." She looked at him. "Like what?" he shrugged. "Things that last." Leora stepped outside. The stars were clear overhead. She stood in front of him, close enough to see the worry lines around his eyes. "Then maybe we both start slow," she said. He smiled, soft. "I would like that." She reached out, unsure, and let her fingers touch his hand. He did not pull away. He only turned his hand so her palm fit into his. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not loneliness, but something steady, something like hope. By the end of the week, Waylon had moved from the barn to the lean-to beside the shed, still giving her space but no longer sleeping with the scent of hay in his nose. Leora had suggested it after a morning spent mending a broken gate hinge together. She'd handed him an extra blanket without comment, and he'd nodded, understanding more than she said. The days had begun to stretch longer, the sun lingering in the sky like it didn't quite want to leave. The soil had thawed enough to take seed, and Leora had already turned the back plot with her mule, but her shoulder protested the motion of the hoe. Without a word, Waylon had taken it from her hand and sunk the blade into the earth with quiet rhythm. "You always work like you're trying not to be seen," she said, dusting her palms. He leaned into another stroke. "Habit," she narrowed her eyes. "From what?" "Spent some time riding dispatch in the war," he said. "Gray coat." "Afterward, I didn't much care for being looked at." She studied his profile. "You don't seem ashamed." "I'm not, but folks don't always ask before they judge." Leora pushed her hair back with a streaked hand. "I know how that feels." He looked up at her, the sunlight catching in his lashes. "I figured you did." She changed the subject, but not the tone. "There's a wild plum grove west of here, past the creek. They bloom around this time. I used to go with Pa before planting season." Waylon wiped his brow. "You want to walk there?" "I was thinking tomorrow." "If you've got nowhere else to be," he nodded. "I'll saddle the horses first thing." That night she didn't close the cabin door all the way, just let it rest on the latch. Morning brought a thin mist along the lowlands. They rode out slow, the air bright with birdsong and thawed grass. Leora wore a faded shawl she hadn't bothered with all winter. Waylon noticed but didn't comment. They crossed the creek where the stones rose high enough to stay dry. Leora dismounted first and tied her reins to a crooked pine. She reached for the low branches, brushing aside damp needles. "There," she said, the grove opened like a secret. Pale blossoms hung in clusters, catching light through the canopy. The ground was soft with last year's leaves. She stepped forward and tilted her face up into the bloom. Waylon stood a few paces behind, arms loose at his sides. "I haven't seen anything like this," he said. Leora turned. "You don't get blossoms like these in Texas." "Not ones I remember." She smiled, not wide but deeply. "Pick one." Waylon hesitated, then reached for a low branch and plucked a small cluster, careful not to break more than he had to. He handed it to her without speaking. She pressed the petals to her cheek. "Feels like spring's apologizing for the wait," she said. He studied her. "You always talk like that." She lowered the flower. "Like what?" "Like you see more than what's in front of you." Leora shrugged, suddenly shy. "Maybe I just learned to look harder." They sat beneath the trees, their horses grazing a few yards off. She leaned back against the trunk and pulled her knees up. "You ever had a place of your own?" she asked. Waylon shook his head. "Closest I came was a bunkhouse with 4 other men. After that, I just kept riding. And now," he picked up a twig and rolled it between his fingers. "Now I'm thinking about what it'd be like to stop." She didn't answer, but her hand brushed the hem of his coat where it lay beside her, not quite holding, not quite letting go. They stayed until the sun pushed past the trees and softened the edges of the world. On the ride back, neither said much, but they didn't need to. That evening, Leora stirred a pan of corn mush over the fire while Waylon carved a new handle for her hoe. She glanced toward him. "There's a barn dance in town in a few weeks," she said. "I don't go." He looked up. "Why not?" she shrugged. "Too many eyes, too many folks remembering I arrived here with Pa and not a husband." Waylon set the carving down. "I could go with you." She blinked. "You'd do that, if you wanted." Her voice was quiet. "Maybe." He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You'll let me know." She nodded. The fire crackled between them. Leora leaned forward and set the pan aside, then stood and walked over. She reached up, fingers brushing his jaw. "I don't know how to start things," she said. Waylon's breath caught. "You already did." And then, without ceremony, he bent down and kissed her soft, measured, like rain easing onto dry ground. When she pulled back, her lips trembled, not from fear, but from something unmet until now. "I didn't expect that," she whispered. He rested his forehead against hers. "Me neither, but I'm glad we didn't wait." She laced her fingers through his. "I think," she said, "I'd like to see what comes next." Waylon nodded, voice low. So would I. The first rain of May came softly, tapping against the cabin roof like a lullaby. Leora stood barefoot on the porch, her apron heavy with damp, watching the drops gather on the edge of the eaves. Waylon had gone to check the low pasture before the worst of it came in, and now she waited, arms folded, eyes fixed on the trail that curled between the cottonwoods. He returned leading his gelding by the reins, hat pulled low, shirt soaked through the shoulders. She stepped aside as he mounted the steps, her fingers brushing his as he passed. "You get caught in it?" she asked. "Not quite," he said, water sliding from his sleeve. "But that creek's swelling fast. Might take the bridge out if it keeps on." She stepped inside and fetched a dry shirt from the chest near the hearth, one of her father's, sleeves a little short. She handed it over without a word, turning away as Waylon stripped off the wet cloth and pulled the dry one over his head. "You always this prepared?" he asked. "I try." His eyes lingered on her a moment as though weighing something. "I've been thinking," he said, "about building a trough system for that back slope. You've got runoff cutting through the soil." She tilted her head. "You planning to stay long enough to dig trenches?" "I'm not a man to promise far ahead," he said, voice even, "but I haven't had a reason to leave yet." The fire crackled. Leora reached for a log and nudged it into place with the poker. The warmth filled the cabin slowly, scenting the air with pine. "I've been thinking, too," she said, "about the way you move around things instead of through them." Waylon leaned against the doorframe. "You saying I talk in circles?" "I'm saying you don't talk when it matters." He crossed the room, stopping a few feet from her. "All right," he said, "ask me straight." She turned, emboldened by the closeness of the room and the even hush of rain outside. "What do you want from me?" He didn't flinch. "A chance. Not just for a place to sleep or chores to fill my hands. I want to build something with someone who doesn't scare easy, someone who sees past what's been." Her chest rose slowly. "I don't know how to be someone's future." "You don't have to," he said. "You just have to let it come one day at a time." Her hands, still dusted with flour from the morning's baking, curled at her sides. "You said you rode dispatch. You see much fighting?" "Enough." "Too much, maybe?" He looked away, jaw tight. "My brother didn't make it home. He was younger, reckless. I made it, and I've been asking why ever since." She stepped toward him, closing the last of the space. "You never told me that. I didn't know if I ought to." "I think you ought to tell me everything," she said, "if you're asking to stay." He reached for her hand, slow and sure, letting his fingers graze her wrist before folding into her palm. "Then I will." They stood like that, the fire warming one side of them, the scent of rain coming in through the cracked window. Her fingers tightened on his. "Tomorrow we can start the trough system," she said softly. "And the day after, maybe you can show me how to ride at a gallop without falling." Waylon smiled, not wide but with a quiet weight. "I'll take it slow." "You always do," she said, and for the first time since her father died, Leora let herself lean, not from weariness, not from need, but because she wanted to. Because something in her understood this man was not passing through, he was finding his way home. The next morning broke pale and cold, a lingering breath of winter refusing to yield. Waylon rose before Leora, stepping outside into the hush before dawn. He carried the spade and the whetstone she'd left by the shed the night before, and by the time the first light touched the far ridge, he'd already mapped the slope behind the back field with his boot heel and a length of twine. Leora found him kneeling in the dirt, not speaking, just running his thumb along the edge of the spade. She watched him for a moment before stepping into the field, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You slept at all?" she asked. "Some." Woke with a thought about how to angle the channel. Didn't want to lose it. She crouched beside him and pulled her gloves from her pocket. "You always this driven when it comes to dirt and water?" He met her gaze, quiet. "When I see something that could wash away, I try to keep it anchored." They worked side by side without much talk. He dug, she cleared, and the trench took shape, slowly measured, clean, steady. She didn't ask questions about how he knew what he did. Something in the way he moved told her he'd earned every bit of that knowledge with sweat and consequence. Around midday, they broke for bread and dried apples beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the field. He peeled a strip of bark and whittled without purpose while she leaned against the trunk and watched birds scatter through the upper branches. "You ever been married?" she asked, not looking at him. "No," Waylon said, setting the bark aside. "Had a woman once, back in Arkansas. Didn't last." "What happened?" She wanted something settled. "I didn't have anything to offer her but a name and a saddle." Leora didn't speak for a long moment. "She's still there. She married a man with land and 2 milk cows." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She made the right choice." Leora plucked a blade of grass and twisted it between her fingers. "You think she was right to choose what was certain? I think some folks need fences around their lives. Others learn to live with open gates." She looked at him then. "And what about you?" "I used to think I couldn't stop moving. Now I'm wondering if I just hadn't found the right place to land." Leora turned the grass in her hand, slow. "I'm not easy to share a life with." "I'm not asking for easy," he said. "I'm asking for true." That night, she cooked corn cakes with wild onion and a strip of venison he'd brought back from a snare. They ate by lamplight, the silence between them not heavy, just full. Afterward, he stepped outside to check the livestock before bed. When he returned, she was waiting at the threshold, her hair unbraided for the first time since he met her. "I don't want you sleeping outside anymore," she said. Waylon's brow lifted slightly. "You sure?" She stepped back, holding the door open. "I wouldn't say it if I weren't." He crossed the floor slowly, leaving his boots by the door, unsure of where to stand. She didn't speak, just took his hand and led him to the cot by the hearth, the one she hadn't used since her father passed. "You can take that one," she said, voice low. "I'll keep to mine." He didn't argue. "Thank you." She turned then, hesitating only a second before stepping close enough to lay her hand against his chest. "I never learned how to trust someone like this," she said. "You don't have to learn it all in one night." "I know," she said. "But I want to try." Waylon covered her hand with his. "Then I'll wait however long you need." The fire burned low. She stood on her toes, kissed his cheek, and let her lips linger there. "That's the second time you surprised me," she said. He touched her waist just briefly. "I hope I keep doing that," she smiled, and it was quiet but honest. "So do I." Outside, the wind shifted. The storm had passed. The land, like them, was learning how to hold steady after the thaw. The barn dance came on the tail of a warm stretch that coaxed green from every slope, and Leora stood in front of the cracked mirror above her washbasin, smoothing down the sleeves of the cotton dress she'd finished hemming the day before. Her hands trembled more from uncertainty than excitement. The last time she'd worn something this pale, it had been church with her father, and she'd sat quiet as a shadow. Waylon waited outside, brushing down the horses. He hadn't said much that morning, but there was a steadiness to him, a kind of quiet anticipation that settled into the corners of the cabin like a light that didn't flicker. She stepped out and he turned, eyes moving over her without rush. He didn't say anything, just walked over and offered his arm. She took it. They rode into town with the sky blooming rose above them, the saddle creaking softly beneath their weight. The small schoolhouse had been cleared of desks and strung with paper lanterns. Fiddle music spilled through the open windows as they tied the horses and walked in. The room was warm with bodies, the smell of pie and sweat mingling with the sound of laughter. Leora felt eyes on her, but none lingered, not like they used to. Not when Waylon placed his hand on the small of her back and guided her to the edge of the dance floor, his presence solid and calm. "You don't have to if you'd rather not," he said, watching the couples spin unevenly across the floor. "I want to," she replied, surprising herself. He took her hand, his palm rough, his hold gentle. They moved slowly, not trying to match the music, just easing into each step like they were learning each other through motion instead of words. He didn't lead her in wide circles, just small ones, close, steady. "You always this careful?" she asked, breath low. "With things that matter," he said. They danced twice. After they stepped outside where the air was cool and the porch quiet. The lanterns inside swayed with the draft, casting light across the yard. She leaned against the rail. "Folks didn't stare like I thought they would." "That's not your burden anymore," he said. She looked at him. "Was it ever yours?" His jaw worked a moment before he answered. I used to think I had to carry what I didn't fix, but I know better now. You can't bring back what's gone. You can only hold what's still here. She reached for his hand, interlacing their fingers. Then hold this. They didn't return home until moonrise. The road was quiet and the world around them hushed with spring. She leaned against him in the saddle and he didn't say anything. Just wrapped his arm around her and rode steady. That night, she didn't leave him to the cot by the hearth. She took his hand and led him to the bed, neither speaking as they lay side by side. The silence was different now, not waiting, not uncertain. When morning broke, they rose together and started the coffee, and when he kissed her cheek before heading out to feed the mule, she didn't flinch. She smiled. Weeks passed like that, one after another, stitched together with chores and shared meals and quiet glances that said more than speech ever could. He built shelving in the root cellar for the jars she planned to fill come summer. She started sewing a second quilt from the worn shirts he could no longer wear. They made no formal promises. None were needed. One afternoon in June, she stood by the riverbank while Waylon pulled a net from the shallows. The sun caught on the water and the trees whispered above them. She watched him for a long time before speaking. "I've been thinking about putting in a second garden bed, maybe melons this year." He looked over his shoulder. "That mean I'm staying?" She stepped closer, water soaking the toes of her boots. "You been gone once since you got here." "No." "Then you already knew." He straightened, the net heavy with silver flash. "Guess I did." She reached for the net, helping him lift it. "We'll need to build another smoke rack." "I'll cut the poles tomorrow," he said. That night they sat on the porch, the sky wide and lavender above them. She rested her head on his shoulder and he laced their fingers together. "I never thought I'd have this," she said, voice low. "What's this?" he asked. "A place that feels like mine. And someone who doesn't want to change it, just be in it with me." Waylon leaned his cheek against her hair. "I never wanted to change you, I know." They stayed like that until the stars came out, and even after the fire burned low, neither moved to go inside. Years passed. The land gave them hard work and quiet joys. The garden grew, the chickens multiplied, and the creek never took the bridge again. He built a second room onto the cabin. She kept the old rocking chair by the hearth. They didn't leave. They didn't need to. In the fall of their third year, she gave birth to a boy with his father's quiet gaze and her stubborn mouth. They named him Illy, after no one in particular, just because it felt right. Waylon carved him a cradle from pine. Leora stitched his first cap from scraps of the shawl she'd worn that night to the dance. They lived like that, honest, steady, unhurried. The past never left them, but it stopped haunting, and what they built together held no declarations. No grand gestures. Just days strung like beads, each one earned. And when the seasons turned and the snows came and the fire burned warm in the hearth, they sat side by side, her hand in his, their boy asleep in the crook of her arm. "You still glad you stayed?" she asked. His answer was simple and true. "Every day."